Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we delve into the darkest parts of human history. I hope you're all well. I'm Rob, your host as always, and you're listening to Season 5, Episode 14. Last time, we stepped into something brutal. Something that shows just how far people can go when pushed to the edge. Tonight, we're not stepping away from that, but we're shifting focus. Because this isn't about a battlefield, not in the traditional sense. There are no trenches here, no clear front lines, no opposing armies staring each other down across open ground. This is something else. This is what happens when war moves above you, when it comes from the sky, when it arrives without warning, and there is nowhere to run. Tonight, we're going to Germany, February 1945. The final months of the Second World War. We're looking at the destruction of a city that, up until that point, had largely been spared. A place filled not with soldiers, but with civilians, families, refugees, people who believed they were safe. This is the story of the bombing of Dresden. By the end of this, you'll understand why it's still debated today, why some say it was a necessary act of war, and others see it as something far darker. So, settling close to our fire, because where we are going doesn't begin with the fire, it begins with the belief that the fire wouldn't come. Nevertheless, this is more dark history. To understand why, you need to understand the city itself. Dresden was not just another German city on a map. It had a long history, stretching back over 800 years, growing from a Slavic settlement into the capital of the Kingdom of Saxony. By the end of the 18th century, under rulers like Augustus the Strong, Dresden became one of Europe's cultural centres. Art, music, and architecture flourished. Grand Baroque buildings rose along the banks of the Elbe River, and the city earned the nickname the Florence of the Elbe. It was a place built to impress. Churches like the Frauenreich dominated the skyline. Galleries had priceless works of art. Opera houses and theatres drew crowds. Even as Europe shifted into the industrial age, Dresden held on to that identity. It was known for culture first, industry second, and that reputation would matter later. By the time the Second World War reached its final phase, Germany was collapsing. The Allies were closing in from both sides. In the West, British and American forces had pushed deep into German territory following the D-Day landings in 1944. In the East, the Soviet army was advancing rapidly after major offensives like the Vistula-Oder offensive. Cities were falling one by one. Infrastructure was breaking down. Supply lines were failing. And above it all, there was the bombing campaigns. For years, the Allies had carried out sustained raids on German cities. Industrial centres were hit hard. Hamburg had already endured the firestorms of Operation Gomorrah. Berlin had repeatedly been bombed, its streets reduced to rubble in many districts. By 1945, air raid sirens, blackouts, and destruction were simply part of daily life for much of the German population. But Dresden was not like those cities. By that stage of the war, it had been spared the worst of the bombing. There had been raids, but nothing to the scale seen elsewhere. The city still stood largely intact. The Baroque skyline remained. The theatres and churches still defined its identity. It looked, at least on the surface, like a place the war had passed by. That mattered more than the people realised, because it created distance. Not a physical distance from the war, but a psychological distance. The idea that somehow Dresden was different, that it was too cultural, too historic, too valuable to be destroyed in the same way as an industrial city. There were factories, yes, rail lines passed through the city, connecting east and west. It wasn't untouched by conflict, but compared to the places like Berlin or Hamburg, it felt safe. And as the war dragged on, that reputation spread. Refugees began to arrive in growing numbers. Civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet army moved westward, away from the front lines, carrying whatever they could, many of them ending up in Dresden. They believed it would be a place of relative safety, somewhere the war had not yet fully reached. By early 1945, the population had swollen far beyond its normal size. Homes were overcrowded. Public buildings were filled with families. People slept wherever there was space. Hallways, basements, makeshift shelters. The city strained under the weight of it. Food was scarce. Resources were stretched thin. People were exhausted, hungry, and uncertain about what came next. But they were alive. And more importantly, they believed, some more than others, that they were out of reach. By early 1945, the war in Europe was clearly approaching its end, but the violence had not yet eased. Nazi Germany was no longer expanding, or even holding its ground in any meaningful way. It was collapsing under sustained pressure. From the east, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, cutting through German territory and pushing ever closer to Berlin. From the west, British and American forces continued their advance following D-Day, driving inwards and tightening the encirclement. Germany was being crushed between two fronts. Cities were falling one after another. Transport networks were failing under constant attack. Railways were disrupted, roads damaged, and communication systems strained or destroyed. The country's ability to function, let alone fight, was breaking down. But despite this, the bombing campaign did not stop. The objective had moved beyond simply defeating Germany's army. The aim was to dismantle its entire capacity to continue the war. That meant targeting infrastructure, transport routes, and any remaining systems that allowed troops and supplies to move. It was a strategy of total disruption. Within that context, Dresden became a target. The city was an important transport hub. Rail lines passed through it, linking different parts of Germany and connecting to the Eastern Front. Troops, equipment, and refugees all moved along those routes. Communication networks also relied on the same infrastructure. Even late in the war, Dresden still had strategic value. But there was another factor shaping the decision, one that remains controversial: morale. There was a belief among Allied planners that bombing could do more than destroy physical targets. It could weaken the population's will to continue. The idea was that large-scale destruction, especially in cities that had not yet experienced it, might accelerate the collapse from within. Whether that belief was justified is still debated. Some argue it shortened the war. Others see it as unnecessary destruction at a point when Germany was already defeated in all but name. At the time, however, it influenced real decisions, and Dresden, still largely intact, while so many other cities had already been devastated, became part of that strategy. On the night of February the 13th, 1945, the air raid sirens began to sound across the city. For many residents, this was not entirely unfamiliar. There had been warnings before, alarms that led nowhere, aircraft that passed overhead without attacking. Dresden had, until then, avoided the kind of sustained bombing seen in the cities like Hamburg or Berlin. So when the sirens sounded, the reaction was not immediate panic. There was hesitation. Some people made their way towards shelters, moving with urgency, but not fear. Others waited, listened, trying to judge whether this was another false alarm. Some stayed where they were, convinced it would pass as it had before. But this time, it did not pass. The first wave of bombers approached under the cover of darkness. Aircraft from the Royal Air Force flew in formation, moving steadily towards the city with precision and intent. Then, the bombing began. The first bombs were not meant to set the city alight. They were meant to break it open. High explosive bombs fell first, tearing into Dresden with force. Buildings were split apart. Roofs were blown away. Windows shattered across entire streets in seconds. Walls collapsed inward, burying those inside. Roads were ripped open, and beneath them water mains burst, flooding some areas while leaving others without any supply at all. Firefighting systems, already limited, were crippled almost immediately. This was not uncontrolled destruction, it was deliberate. The initial wave was designed to expose the city, to strip away its protection, to make it vulnerable to what would follow, and what followed was fire. After the high explosives came the incendiaries. Thousands of small bombs, each designed to ignite on impact. They fell in dense clusters, scattering burning material across rooftops, through shattered windows, into streets already choked with debris. At first, the fires seemed separate, small, scattered blazes breaking out across different parts of the city. A roof here, a room there, something that under different circumstances might have been controlled. But there was no containing this. The flames began to spread. Wood beams caught quickly, dried out from age and exposure by earlier blasts. Furniture ignited. Curtains, floors, entire interiors went up in seconds. Buildings, already damaged by explosions, began to burn from the inside out. Their structures weakened, their contents feeding the fire. Then the fires started to merge, and more incendiaries fell and more buildings began to ignite. The heat began to build across entire districts. The air itself started to move differently. Oxygen was drawn towards the growing flames, feeding them, intensifying them, turning the scattered fires into something far more dangerous. And then it changed completely. It became a firestorm. Temperatures rose to extreme levels, far beyond anything most people had ever experienced. The heat created its own weather system. Winds formed within the city, pulling air inwards to the centre of the flames with increasing force. The fire no longer spread naturally. It pulled everything into itself. It fed on whatever it could reach. Wood, fabric, fuel, buildings, and eventually people. Those caught outside were dragged towards it. Not figuratively, but physically. The movement of the air and the force of the heat pulled people off their feet, drawing them into burning areas they could not escape. Clothes ignited, skin burnt in seconds. Inside shelters, survival was not guaranteed. The fire above consumed oxygen at such a rate that the air below began to thin. Breathing became difficult, then impossible. Some people suffocated where they sat, trapped underground as the fire stripped the earth from around them. Others tried to escape, desperate for fresh air, only to emerge into streets that were already engulfed. The heat reached levels high enough to distort the environment itself. Glass softened and ran down walls. Metal fixtures warped and twisted. Structures that had survived the initial blasts began to fail under the sustained temperature. And at the middle of it all were the people, running through the streets that no longer felt real, searching for family members in smoke so thick it blocked everything out. Trying to navigate a city that had become unrecognisable in a matter of hours. Trying to survive something that had already grown far beyond anybody's control. By the time the bombing had stopped, Dresden was no longer the city it had been the day before. Entire districts had been erased. Buildings that had stood for centuries were gone, reduced to collapsing walls and blackened rubble. Streets that had once been crowded with people were unrecognisable, buried under debris and ash. The skyline that had defined the city, the churches, the domes, the landmarks, had been torn apart or left hollowed and broken. Bodies lay where they had fallen, in the streets, inside buildings, in the shelters where people had believed that they would be safe. Some were burnt beyond recognition, reduced to shapes rather than people. Others remained where they had collapsed, caught in the moment they had tried to run, or failed to. And the fires did not stop when the bombing ended. They continued into the next day and beyond that. What remained of the city still fed the flames. Timber, furniture, anything combustible continued to burn, sending smoke across what was left of Dresden. The heat lingered. The air was thick and difficult to breathe. Those who survived moved through it in a kind of silence. Some called out for family members. Others searched without speaking at all, stepping over rubble, moving through ruins that no longer resembled the places they had known. There were moments of relief. People found alive beneath debris, pulled from collapsing spaces. But far more often, there was nothing to find. The scale of the death was not immediately clear. In the days that followed, numbers began to circulate, many of them exaggerated. Some through confusion, others through deliberate distortion. For decades, the true figures remained debated. More careful research has since placed the number of dead at around 25,000 people. The number does not make the event smaller. If anything, it makes it more defined, because those deaths were not spread over a distance or time. They happened in a confined space, within hours, under conditions that left little chance for survival. It was concentrated, overwhelming destruction. The aftermath reflected that scale. There were too many bodies to bury individually. Identification was often impossible. Mass cremations were carried out in an attempt to deal with the dead, reducing them to ash because there was no other practical way to manage what had been left behind. And the damage to the city went beyond what could be rebuilt. Dresden was physically broken, but the psychological impact ran deep. Survivors carried the memories of what they had seen, what they had lost, and what they had endured. A city once known for its culture and beauty had been transformed in a matter of hours into something defined by destruction. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this dark episode. Apologies that this week's episode is a little shorter than usual. At the time of writing and recording, I've just got married. And if you've ever planned a wedding yourself, you'll know just how stressful and time-consuming the weeks leading up to it can be. Once it's all over, you're left completely exhausted. On top of that, a couple of my children have been ill at different times, so life has simply got in the way over the last few weeks. Sometimes family has to come first. That said, I didn't want to leave you all without an episode. I'd much rather bring you a slightly shorter one than disappear for a week altogether. Thank you as always for your patience, understanding and continued support. It really does mean a lot. The bombing of Dresden is one of those moments in history that doesn't sit neatly. No matter how you look at it, it resists being boxed into something simple or easily explained. You can understand the reasoning behind it. You can follow the logic, the strategy, the context of a war that had already pushed every side into extremes. And still, at the same time, you feel a sense of discomfort that doesn't go away. It's not just the scale of destruction, although that alone was difficult to grasp. It's the speed of it, the way an entire city, one that has stood for centuries, could be reduced to ruins in the space of a single night. And I keep coming back to that. Because the people inside didn't have time. There was no real moment to understand what was happening. No space to process it. No way to prepare for the reality of it. One moment there was a city that still felt intact. Still felt safe enough to live in. And then, within hours, that world was gone. And I suppose that's what makes it difficult to settle in your mind. Not just what happened, but how quickly it happened. And what little chance everyone had to truly grasp it before it was already over. Anyway, before we go, if this episode stayed with you, it would mean a lot if you left a rating or a review, wherever you listen. It really helps more people find the show. And if you know someone who'd be gripped by this kind of history, please share the episode with them. If you want to support the show more directly, you can find all of our links to our socials, our merch store, and our Patreon in the show notes or description below. Our Patreon members get every episode ad-free, which is a great way to dive even deeper. Plus, this is where you can find our show notes and other bits and bats. Picking up a t-shirt or a mug from the store helps keep the lights on. All of this is optional, but deeply appreciated. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, please do so. It's the best way to make sure you never miss a story. Your support is what lets us keep digging into these dark corners. And again, thank you for your support. So, with all that out the way, don't forget, if you're looking for another strange story to dive into, check out Dark's Travelling Emporium. Thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode as we delve into another event and more dark history.